It was Christmas night in Chicago. Snow resting softly on the rooftops, the streets glowing under the silver lights of Michigan Avenue. I sat by my window, watching families gather through warm-lit windows, while my phone stayed silent. I had 7 sons, yet not one had called. I gave them life, homes, and everything a mother could give. But that night, I was a stranger to them. They forgot the hands that fed them. What happened next changed everything. If you're watching this, stay till the end. Like, subscribe, and hear how silence became my greatest revenge. The night had the kind of stillness that only Christmas brings. The world wrapped in tinsel. Laughter echoing faintly from every window but mine. I had spent the day baking gingerbread, the smell of cinnamon and sugar filling my small kitchen. On the counter sat 7 tins of biscuits, each labeled with a name. My sons, my pride. I bundled myself in my old wool coat, the same one I'd worn since their childhood, and set out across the icy streets of Chicago. The snow crunched under my boots as I carried the boxes carefully, one by one, like small offerings of love that had taken a lifetime to prepare. My first stop was my eldest son's home on Belmont Avenue. The lights shimmered through the frosted windows, laughter spilled onto the street, and I could almost see the outline of a Christmas tree glowing in the corner. I smiled, thinking of the years I had saved just to buy those first ornaments when they were boys. But when I knocked, the sound felt strange, hollow, unwanted. I waited, clutching the tin against my chest. A shadow moved behind the curtain, then a voice came from inside, muffled, cold. "Mom, we're busy tonight." Busy. On Christmas. The words sat in the air like frostbite. I stood for a moment, staring at the blurred shapes of my family through the glass. I saw them raise glasses, heard faint music, and realized the door would never open. My fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the kind of ache that no coat can warm. I turned, stepping back into the snow, and walked toward the next house, hoping, foolishly, that the next door might open. Each house was the same. Laughter inside, silence outside. Excuses through locked doors. One son said he had guests. Another said they'd come by next week. Another simply didn't answer. By the time I reached the last house, my feet were numb, and the sky had deepened into the dark blue of forgotten promises. I walked past Michigan Avenue, where couples held hands under the lights, children dragged sleds through the snow, and the city sparkled like a dream built for someone else. I passed shop windows filled with toys, ribbons, and things I could never afford when they were young. Back then, I would have given anything to see them smile. Now, they smiled, but not for me. When I finally reached home, the clock struck midnight. The sound echoed in my small living room, each chime reminding me that another year had ended without a single hug from the boys I'd raised. The biscuits sat untouched on the table, their ribbons shining in the candlelight. I sat beside them, listening to the wind whisper through the cracks in the window, carrying distant laughter from streets that had forgotten my name. The Christmas tree in the corner was old and crooked, its lights blinking unevenly. One bulb out, like a missing heartbeat. I had decorated it alone earlier that week, hoping that maybe, just maybe, one of them would stop by. I even wrapped 7 small gifts: handkerchiefs, socks, a little book, things they'd once laughed at but needed. They sat there still, waiting for hands that would never reach for them. For years, I had told myself they were busy, that success had stolen their time, but not their hearts. But that night, under the cold light of a lonely room, I realized something sharp. They hadn't forgotten me by accident. They had moved on by choice. My motherhood had expired in their eyes the moment it stopped being convenient. I blew out the candle, its smoke curling like a sigh. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the streets, the roofs, and finally my doorstep. Like a clean sheet drawn over an old memory. I pulled my shawl tighter and whispered to the silence that had become my companion. That night, I didn't cry. Not a single tear fell. I simply stared at the clock ticking past midnight and thought of the years I spent nursing them through fevers, holding their hands through storms, feeding them when I had nothing for myself. They had taken the warmth I had and left me with the cold. And yet, somewhere deep inside the ache, another feeling stirred. Not anger, not revenge. Something calmer, sharper. It was the feeling that comes when love finally breaks and truth takes its place. A mother can forgive many things, but not the moment her children choose comfort over her presence. As dawn began to break, faint gold slipping through the blinds, I looked at the tins of biscuits again. My sons had feasted that night, and I had starved. But the hunger I felt wasn't for food, it was for justice. And justice, I realized, would come, not through shouting or tears, but through the same quiet patience that raised them. That night, as Christmas turned into mourning, my heart made a decision that would turn their comfort into consequence. Before the loneliness of that Christmas, there were decades filled with purpose. I was once a young mother in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, where the walls were thin, the winters cruel, and dreams small but stubborn. My husband had died when the youngest was barely 2, leaving me with 7 mouths to feed and no savings. I worked double shifts at a garment factory on West Roosevelt Road, sewing clothes for strangers who would never know the woman behind their fine collars. My fingers bled from the needle, but my heart never complained. Every stitch was a promise to my children that they would never go hungry. Morning after morning, I'd wake before sunrise to pack lunches, sometimes nothing more than peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices, before taking the bus downtown. In those years, the world seemed to move faster than I could afford to live in it. But whenever I returned home, weary from work, their faces would light up, and for a moment, every sacrifice felt worth it. I made their Halloween costumes from scraps, their winter coats from second-hand fabric, and their school projects from boxes I found behind stores. At night, when the city slept, I'd sit by the window, budgeting by candlelight, deciding whether to pay the gas bill or buy shoes for the one who had outgrown his pair again. I never bought for myself. I wore the same coat year after year, the one with the missing button they used to tease me about. There was no Christmas tree in those early years, just paper stars we cut from old newspapers, taped to the wall to make them believe magic could be homemade. I remember their laughter, how it filled the house, even when there wasn't much food on the table. Love was enough back then. When each of them turned 18, I made the same quiet promise to help them build something bigger than I ever could. I co-signed loans, dipped into the savings I'd built over 30 years, and even sold my late husband's watch to pay for one of their wedding deposits. I was the bridge between their past and their comfort, and I crossed it willingly, barefoot, without complaint. Years passed. The boys became men. They built lives in better houses, drove newer cars, and spoke faster than I could keep up. They thanked me at first. Phone calls, birthday cards, gifts at Christmas. But slowly, gratitude became routine, then rare, then gone. I'd hear about their promotions through neighbors, about their vacations through Facebook posts. The mother who had been their home became a quiet afterthought. Still, I never stopped defending them. When people said sons forget their mothers after marriage, I'd laugh it off. Not mine, I'd say proudly. My boys remember who raised them. I believed it because I had to. Even when I fell ill one winter, coughing through the nights, I refused to call them. I didn't want to be a burden. I told myself they were busy building futures, and I had done my part. I'd sit by the window, watching buses pass by, wondering if any of them would stop by unannounced the way they used to when they were young, with noise, hugs, and empty stomachs ready for my cooking. But they never came. The truth I learned too late is that sacrifice doesn't guarantee remembrance. I gave them every piece of me, and they built their lives with it, leaving nothing behind for me to hold. My reward was not in their success, but in their distance. Yet, I didn't hate them. I pitied them. Because I knew one day the world would remind them what it feels like to stand alone. The irony is that everything they own, from their first car to their newest home, carried traces of me. My name sat quietly on their paperwork. My savings powered their beginnings, and my faith carried their risks. I was the invisible foundation beneath their pride. They never noticed, and I never reminded them. I thought love didn't need acknowledgement. That Christmas night proved me wrong. Love does need acknowledgement, not in gifts or words, but in presence. They had taken mine for granted so long that when I knocked on their doors, I was no longer mum. I was a memory they'd outgrown. And yet, even as I sat alone that night, I didn't wish for revenge. I wished for revelation. For them to see one day that the comfort they lived in was never earned alone. But sometimes, lessons don't come through words. Sometimes they come through loss. As years passed, the bond that once tied us began to thin, not with arguments or anger, but with silence. It started quietly. Shorter visits, missed calls, birthdays forgotten until the next morning. My sons, who once crowded the kitchen table in laughter, now treated it as a stop on their way to somewhere better. Each of them had a reason. Work is busy. The kids have practice. We'll come by next week. The excuses changed, but the pattern remained. I became a figure in their rear-view mirrors. Always there, always small, fading further the faster they drove. It was strange how success could erase memories faster than time. When they moved into bigger houses, in places like Naperville, Aurora, and Evanston, I helped pack boxes and smiled as they posed for photos in front of their new driveways. Those pictures were for their walls, not mine. I noticed it each time I visited. My photos gone from their mantles, replaced by new lives, new priorities. I didn't belong in their version of happiness anymore. The phone calls became less about, "How are you, Mom?" and more about, "Do you still have those documents?" Or, "Can you co-sign this one last time?" Each time I said yes, because love makes fools of mothers. I wanted to believe that helping them would bring them closer again. Instead, it only taught them that I'd never say no. Holidays grew quieter. Thanksgiving dinners turned into invitations that arrived too late to mean anything. One son hosted a party in New York once and forgot to tell me. I found out from a neighbor's niece's Facebook post. There they were, my sons, their wives, their children, smiling in matching sweaters under a glittering Manhattan skyline. I zoomed in on the photo, searching for a trace of the little boys I once knew, but all I saw were men I didn't recognize. Money changed them too. They started wearing pride like armor, expensive watches, designer suits, the kind of luxury that doesn't fill the heart, but looks good on the outside. When I'd visit, they'd talk about stock prices and property investments, never asking about the aching joints that came from years of standing at factory machines. They forgot I once worked 12-hour shifts to keep their dreams alive. It wasn't just neglect, it was distance dressed as maturity. They said they were independent now, but independence doesn't mean forgetting the hands that built your wings. Every time I left their homes, I'd walk to the train station in silence, clutching my purse tight, pretending the tears in my eyes were from the cold. When I'd call, sometimes their wives would answer, their voices polite but sharp, the kind that slices through affection with a single word. "He's busy right now," they'd say. "We'll call you later." Later rarely came. I started memorizing the sound of my own ringtone because it rang so little. I kept their childhood rooms just as they were. Toys neatly arranged, old clothes folded, even the faded baseball glove one of them left behind after college. I dusted those shelves weekly, not because they needed cleaning, but because I needed purpose. Their rooms smelled of the past, something warm and unreachable. It was the only part of them I still had. But what hurt the most wasn't their absence. It was the slow transformation of love into transaction. The moment affection turns into obligation, motherhood becomes a job no one values anymore. They sent money occasionally, thinking it replaced their presence. But love doesn't arrive in envelopes. It arrives in footsteps, and mine had long stopped echoing through their doors. I told myself they'd remember someday, that maybe when their own children grew, they'd understand the weight of sacrifice. But years went by, and no realization came. The gap between us wasn't measured in miles, but in care. I would have rather lived in a small house full of love than watch my sons in mansions built on forgetfulness. And yet, I never cursed them. Mothers don't curse. We ache quietly, forgive loudly, and hope the lesson finds them in time. But when Christmas arrived that year, when I stood outside their glowing houses, gifts in hand, ignored at every doorstep, I felt something I hadn't felt before. It wasn't sorrow. It was finality. That night, as I sat alone under the flickering light of my kitchen bulb, I realized that love without respect is charity, and I was done giving mine away for free. Christmas Eve used to be sacred in my house. It was the one night I believed no one could be too busy, too proud, or too far to forget family. That belief died slowly, one doorstep at a time. I left my small apartment before sunset, holding a wicker basket of gifts, homemade scarves, little jars of jam, and old photographs I thought they'd like to frame. Snowflakes brushed my hair as I walked through the streets of Chicago, each one melting into a chill that settled deeper than the wind ever could. The first house stood on a quiet lane in Naperville, its roof lined with lights that twinkled like gold. Through the frosted windows, I saw my eldest son sitting beside a grand tree, laughter rising from the warmth inside. I smiled, believing this would be the house that welcomed me in. I knocked gently, then again. For a moment I thought I heard footsteps, but they stopped. Then a muffled voice behind the door said, "Mom, we'll call you tomorrow, okay? We're having guests tonight." The word guest hit harder than the cold. I wanted to say I'd just come to drop off gifts, that I'd baked his favorite ginger cookies, that I didn't need a chair at the table, just 5 minutes at the door. But I didn't. I just stood there, snow collecting on my shoulders, until the silence became unbearable. Then I turned and walked away. The second son lived in Aurora, not far from the river where the lights shimmered like 1,000 tiny hopes. His porch, smelled of cinnamon and pine, and children's laughter echoed from inside. I smiled, thinking his kids, my grandchildren, would be excited to see me. But when I knocked, it was his wife who appeared behind the curtain. She looked at me, then turned away. The door didn't open. A text came minutes later. We're just settling down with family. Maybe next week. I stood there, staring at the message glowing against the dark, and realized I wasn't part of that word anymore. Family. By the time I reached the third house in Evanston, my legs were trembling from the cold. My breath formed clouds in the air, small ghosts that vanished as quickly as I did from their lives. I could see through the window. The soft glow of the TV, my son's wife passing out gifts, my grandchildren unwrapping presents. For a moment I thought I saw him glance toward the window, but he didn't move. My knock went unanswered. Each door I visited that night was a chapter in a book I never wanted to read, one titled, A Mother Forgotten. Every next week was a lie. Every sorry, a wound dressed in manners. I walked through the snow like a ghost of Christmas past, uninvited, unseen, unwanted. The streets glittered with lights and laughter, but none of it belonged to me. By the time I got home, my fingers were stiff, and the scarf I'd knitted was wet with melted snow. I placed the basket on the table and stared at the gifts that would never be opened. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the old heater and the ticking clock on the wall. I lit a single candle and sat beside it, its flame dancing against the tears I refused to shed. I ate my supper alone, a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. The food tasted of emptiness. The gifts I had carried with so much hope now sat like reminders of foolish love. For the first time, I truly felt what loneliness was. Not the absence of people, but the absence of care. Outside, church bells rang across the city, announcing midnight mass. Families gathered in pews, hands joined, voices raised in joy. I stayed where I was, too tired to pray, too proud to beg. I looked around my small room, the faded curtains, the chipped mug, the old photos on the wall. Every item told a story of sacrifice, of love freely given and easily forgotten. That night, I understood something that took 70 years to learn. That family is not always the people who share your name. Sometimes it's just the person who remembers your worth. My sons had forgotten mine. I didn't feel anger then, only a hollow clarity. It was as if something inside me had finally stopped waiting. I realized I had spent my life giving. But now, it was time to take back what was mine. Not out of hate, but out of justice. I blew out the candle and whispered to the dark, "This chapter ends tonight." And it did. Because the next morning, while they woke surrounded by gifts and laughter, I woke with something they didn't have. Resolve. That night of humiliation did not end with tears. It ended with clarity. The morning sun broke through the thin curtains of my apartment in downtown Chicago, and for the first time in years, I felt awake, not from rest, but from realization. I walked to my bedroom closet, opened the old wooden trunk beneath the folded blankets, and pulled out a small metal box I hadn't touched in decades. Inside it were memories that no one else knew existed. Paper, ink, signatures, and proof of everything I had built and everything they had borrowed. The box smelled faintly of rust and old ink, but to me, it smelled like power. The quiet kind that doesn't boast, only waits. I placed it on the kitchen table, next to my half-drunk coffee, and began sorting through the documents. Each paper told a story, not of revenge, but of trust. Loan papers from the time my eldest son bought his first home in Naperville. Mortgage guarantees for the second one's restaurant venture in Evanston. Bank authorizations tied to the youngest's auto business on the edge of Milwaukee. My name was everywhere. Small, neat, in blue ink at the bottom of each page. I remembered the days I had signed them. Each moment came back with clarity. The eldest had hugged me and said it was just a formality. The second had promised to pay me back with interest. The youngest had cried when I co-signed his first lease, saying he'd never forget. And yet, they all forgot. Not the money, not the help, but the hands that had made it possible. I never reminded them because love doesn't ask for receipts. But that morning, as I spread those papers across the table, I realized something vital. Love may not ask for proof, but respect requires it. And I had all the proof I needed. I took my time reading every line, every clause. My eyesight blurred at times, but my memory filled the gaps. I had made sure back then that every transaction went through my account first. Not because I didn't trust them, but because the lawyer had advised it. Protect yourself, he had said, even from those you love. At the time, I thought it sounded cynical. Now I thought it sounded wise. The morning passed quietly. Outside, I could hear children playing in the snow, car horns echoing from Michigan Avenue, and the faint hum of a world moving forward. A world that had left me behind. But inside, time stood still. Every document was a piece of my sacrifice written in legal language, waiting patiently for justice. I made a fresh cup of coffee and sat back down. My fingers trembled as I held one of the oldest papers. The deed to the property in Aurora. My signature, faded but firm, stood at the bottom beside my son's. I traced it with my finger and whispered to myself, "You forgot I still exist on this page." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. I gathered the documents, sorted them by name, and placed them neatly in 3 piles. Each pile represented a life built on my foundation, a life that had turned its back on me. For years, I had thought my motherhood was a bond that couldn't be broken. But bonds, I now realized, were not just emotional. They were legal, too. I spent the next hour writing notes, not letters of anger, but reminders, details my solicitor would need. Account numbers, addresses, the original loan amounts. My handwriting was steady, deliberate, like the work of a woman who had decided to stop being sentimental and start being exact. As the church bells rang for morning mass, I closed the metal box and locked it again. But this time, it wasn't a box of memories. It was a weapon. A silent one made of paper and ink. The kind of weapon that doesn't wound the body but pierces pride. Before noon, I took the L train to the city's business district. The cold wind followed me through the streets of downtown Chicago as I walked into the old law firm on Wacker Drive, the same one that had once handled my husband's estate. The receptionist looked surprised to see a frail old woman walk in with a metal box, but I smiled kindly. "I'm here to revisit some contracts," I said. The lawyer who met me remembered me instantly. Gray hair now, but the same calm eyes. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "you've kept everything?" I nodded. "Everything," I replied, "even the promises they forgot." He examined the documents carefully, line by line. Then he looked at me and said softly, "You have every right to act, ma'am." Those words were all I needed. When I left his office, the air outside felt lighter, almost forgiving. Snowflakes danced across the Chicago River, as if blessing my decision. For years, I had believed silence was a virtue. That morning, I learned it could also be a weapon, sharper than any word spoken in anger. That box wasn't just paper. It was my redemption, waiting to be signed. When I stepped out of the law firm that morning, the sky over Chicago was painted in pale winter blue, and the air bit at my face with the same sharpness as truth. I had no tears left to cry, no energy left to beg, and no reason to explain. What I had now were papers, signatures, and time. The same things I had once used to build my son's futures. I decided that I would use them again, not out of spite, but out of principle. I walked home slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps match the certainty building inside me. The noise of Michigan Avenue felt distant. Horns, chatter, Christmas carols, all fading beneath the hum of my thoughts. The lawyer's words echoed in my mind. You have every right to act. For the first time in years, I felt like I still had power over my own life, even if it came from ink and not affection. That afternoon, I spread the documents across my kitchen table once again. The sunlight fell across the pages, highlighting my name, that small but unshakable signature printed beneath theirs. Each line was a reminder that while they had taken me for granted, they had also underestimated me. I wasn't just a mother, I was a signatory, a stakeholder, a legal force they had chosen to forget. I sat there for hours drafting a letter, calm and deliberate. No emotion, no trembling hands, only precision. I wrote down everything my solicitor had explained: how to initiate asset recovery, how to exercise my co-ownership rights, how to trigger the repayment clauses they had signed without reading years ago. The process would take time, but justice didn't need to rush. It only needed to arrive. I made 3 folders, one for each son, and filled them with every copy, every receipt, and every clause that bore my name. I used to bake them Christmas cookies. Now I was serving them legal truth. And unlike cookies, this wouldn't crumble. Later that evening, I sat by the window watching snow fall over the streetlights, the city glowing gold and white like a postcard. Somewhere across the skyline, my sons were probably laughing in their grand homes, unaware that the woman they had abandoned had just begun rewriting their story. I didn't smile or frown. I just breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill my lungs with resolve. The next morning, I went back to the law office. The same clerk greeted me, surprised to see me twice in 2 days. "Back so soon?" he asked kindly. I nodded and handed him the folders. "I'd like to begin the process," I said simply. There was no hesitation in my voice, no second thoughts. He nodded, stamped the documents, and began the work. It was official now, not anger, not vengeance, just law. Over the next week, everything moved quietly, like gears turning in a machine that had been waiting to start. The solicitor filed the motions, notified the banks, and began reclaiming my share of every property and investment. He called it execution of clauses. I called it closure. Each phone call confirmed another small victory. Another account frozen, another asset reviewed, another title re-registered. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't need witnesses. Revenge doesn't always wear fire and thunder. Sometimes it wears silence and paperwork. I spent those days in peace, cooking simple meals, watering my plants, walking through Millennium Park when the air was crisp and clean. Each step reminded me that freedom doesn't always come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from boundaries. I thought often about my husband, gone long before our sons became men. He would have been disappointed by what they had become, but proud of what I was doing. He always said, "Maria, never shout to prove your strength. Whisper it with results." That whisper had now become my plan, a quiet symphony of signatures and stamps. By the end of that week, everything was in motion. The bank had confirmed the authorizations, the lawyer had sent formal notices, and the city records were updated to reflect my rightful share. My sons wouldn't know it yet, but the walls around their comfort were beginning to shift. I didn't feel triumph. I felt balance, the kind that comes when a wrong finally meets its reckoning. That night, as I sat by the window again with a cup of tea, I looked out over the lights of Chicago and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Calm. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just calm. The kind that comes when a storm has passed and all that's left is truth. I whispered softly to myself, no shouting, no chaos, just signatures. Because in the end, power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply signs. Christmas morning dawned with quiet irony. The world outside was covered in a soft blanket of snow, untouched and pure. Everything my family's hearts were not. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the steam fogging the glass as the first rays of light hit the Chicago skyline. Somewhere across town, my sons and their families were waking to the warmth of gifts, music, and champagne. They had no idea that while they slept, their comfort had begun to melt away. Quietly, cleanly, legally. The process had unfolded overnight. My solicitor had followed every instruction precisely. The bank notifications went out before dawn. Every linked account that bore my co-ownership was adjusted and frozen for review. The assets, once shielded by their arrogance, were suddenly transparent. Funds that had moved carelessly between personal and business accounts now stood suspended, waiting for lawful verification. To the banks, it was protocol. To me, it was poetry. By mid-morning, the first son would have checked his balance, maybe to transfer money for more gifts or make a payment on his car. I could imagine the look on his face when he saw the zeros replaced by blank holds and red warnings. Then the calls would start. One to the bank, one to his brother, one to his wife. Panic always travels faster than understanding. The second son, the one who managed the restaurant near Evanston, would have opened his email to find a message from his accountant. Urgent notice, property listed under audit. I could see him scrolling in disbelief, his mouth dry, his mind racing to remember what clauses he had ignored. He'd remember my signature then, the one he once called a formality. By noon, the youngest, my sentimental one, the one who used to cry when I left him for work, would receive his call. The voice on the line would inform him that the auto shop lease was being reviewed for ownership validation. He'd protest, stammer, maybe even laugh in denial. But paperwork doesn't waver. It doesn't forgive either. Meanwhile, I sat in silence, sipping my tea, letting the clock tick softly. There was no thrill in watching them panic, no glee in their downfall. Just a steady satisfaction that the universe had finally balanced the scales. They had left me outside on the coldest night of the year, while I had left them inside a storm of their own making. By afternoon, my phone began to buzz. Unknown numbers. Familiar area codes. I didn't answer. Each ring felt like the echo of every time I had waited for their calls. Every time I had stared at my silent phone, hoping they'd remember me. Now, their urgency was met with the same silence they once gave me. As evening fell, messages began pouring in. Apologies, pleas, explanations. Words like misunderstanding and we didn't mean it filled the screen. I read everyone, not with anger, but with detachment. They wanted me to reverse what I had started, to call the lawyer, to fix what they had broken with their neglect. But what they didn't understand was that I hadn't broken anything. I had simply unbalanced what was already unfair. I thought of each of their homes, the polished floors, the expensive furniture, the large dining tables where I had once sat proudly during family dinners. Now, those same tables would host arguments and accusations. The laughter I had once envied would turn into panic. And all of it began not with malice, but with a mother's quiet resolve. At one point, I received a voice message from my eldest. His tone was trembling, somewhere between fear and shame. "Mom, please, can we talk? We didn't mean to hurt you. We just got carried away." I played it once, then again. Not because I enjoyed his regret, but because it reminded me of something important. Remorse always sounds softer when it's too late. Outside, snow began to fall again, heavier now. The world cloaked in silence. I stood by the window and whispered to myself, "It's done." My reflection in the glass looked older, yes, but stronger too. Years of tears had washed me hollow, but justice filled me back up. Somewhere, their Christmas lights still glowed, but behind those lights, their peace was gone, replaced by phone calls, legal confusion, and the slow dawning of accountability. The same accountability I had carried for decades, alone, through sleepless nights and unpaid debts. It didn't matter how wealthy they became, how many cars or houses they owned. They had forgotten one thing that money could never replace: gratitude. And now, the balance sheet of their lives reflected that loss perfectly. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to curse their names. The world had already heard my silence. The next morning, I'd call my solicitor again to confirm that all 3 transfers were proceeding as planned. The sales, the recoveries, the reallocations, everything would unfold in order. No emotion, just paperwork. Because while they spent years thinking I was powerless, I had always held the quietest kind of power, the kind written in ink, resting patiently in a metal box beneath an old bed. 2 days after Christmas, the knocking began, loud, frantic, echoing through my small Chicago apartment. I didn't need to open the door to know who it was. The sound carried their guilt, heavy, uneven, desperate. For years I had knocked on their doors with love, and they had left me standing in the cold. Now the roles had reversed. I let them knock a little longer before I opened. 3 men stood there. My sons, once proud, now pale and trembling like boys again. Their coats were unbuttoned, their eyes red from lack of sleep, and the frost from outside clung to their hair. Behind them, the city street was bright and indifferent, the snow turning the world quiet while their voices filled it with panic. The eldest was the first to speak, his words tumbling out too fast to sound sincere. He tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding, that the bank had made an error. The second cut him off, saying the lawyer must have confused something. The youngest stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on the floor like he was afraid to meet my eyes. They were all talking over one another, just noise, excuses, rehearsed panic disguised as love. I stood still, letting their words hang in the air until they realized I wasn't answering. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. It made them stop talking. For once, they had to listen. The same way I had listened, night after night, to my phone that never rang, waiting for voices that never came. When they finally grew quiet, I walked to the kitchen table and poured 3 cups of tea. The act felt ceremonial. The same table where I had once taught them to read, to pray, to write their names. They sat down reluctantly, their eyes flicking to the old metal box still sitting by the window. The youngest swallowed hard. He remembered it. They all did. I placed my hand on the folder of documents beside me, the same papers that had turned their comfort into consequence. My voice was calm when I finally spoke, because anger wasn't needed anymore. I asked for presence, not payment, I said quietly, but you gave me debt instead of love. None of them looked up. Their shame was louder than my voice. I could see the weight of understanding sinking into their faces. It wasn't just money they had lost. It was me, the mother who had wiped their tears, stitched their uniforms, stayed awake when they were sick, and kept food on the table when she was hungry herself. The eldest tried to reach for my hand, but I drew it back. Not cruelly, just firmly. Some distances must remain to remind people of their actions. He muttered that they were sorry, that they didn't mean to hurt me. But sorrow that only comes after loss isn't apology. It's fear. The youngest finally spoke, his voice breaking. He said they hadn't realized what they had done until now, that Christmas wasn't the same without me. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But belief is something that needs to be earned back, not begged for. We sat in silence again. The clock ticked, and the world outside kept moving. A car passed, snow fell, life went on. Proof that the earth doesn't stop spinning for regret. Finally, I stood up, picked up the folder of papers, and placed it in front of them. These, I said softly, were my promises to you. You broke yours. I kept mine. The eldest blinked back tears, the second clenched his fists, the youngest whispered something too faint to catch, but none of it mattered anymore. I slid the folder back into the box and locked it shut. The law did what my words couldn't, I said, more to myself than to them. Now, go live like the adults you claim to be. They left quietly, shoulders heavy, heads low. I watched them walk down the steps, their figures shrinking against the white Chicago snow. For a moment, I almost called out. Old habits die hard. A mother's instinct to comfort, even when she's the one who's been wronged. But I stayed silent. They needed the weight of that silence more than they needed my forgiveness. When the door finally closed, the house felt still again. Not empty, but peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. They would rebuild their lives, I knew that. Maybe one day they'd understand the difference between love and convenience. But for now, I let them carry the lesson home, the one I had written not with words, but with signatures. Weeks passed after that day, and the snow in Chicago began to melt, leaving behind gray slush and muddy streets, the kind of landscape that mirrors the aftermath of emotions. Life went on, but not the same. My sons had learned the taste of regret, and it was bitter. They didn't know how to reach me anymore, not through money, not through gifts, not through words. For years, I had been the bridge they crossed whenever they needed warmth or forgiveness. Now that bridge had quietly folded itself away, and they were left shouting across a river that didn't answer back. I had moved into a small seaside cottage on the outskirts of Maine, near Bar Harbor, a place I had once visited with my late husband decades ago. The air there carried the scent of salt and pine, and the mornings were painted in soft blue light that touched the sea like forgiveness. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace. I woke up to seagulls, brewed my coffee, and walked along the rocky shore collecting shells. Every step on that coast reminded me of something simple yet powerful. That distance can heal the kind of wounds closeness keeps open. From time to time, letters would arrive. Thin white envelopes, addressed in familiar handwriting, but filled with unfamiliar humility. The first was from the eldest, written in careful lines. He apologized for forgetting the woman who once held the family together, admitting that pride had blinded him. The second letter came from the middle son, who had once prided himself on being the clever one. Now his words stumbled like a child learning to speak. The third wrote the least, only one line: "I miss you, Mum." I read every letter once, then folded them neatly and placed them in a drawer beside the contract copies that had once been my shield. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because sometimes silence carries the weight of truth better than words. My absence in their lives had begun to teach them the lesson my presence never could: that love without gratitude collapses under its own weight. They tried to visit once. I saw their names on the guest list at the local motel. The town was small and news traveled faster than footsteps. I didn't open the door when they came. I watched from behind the curtain as they stood on the porch, holding flowers, their faces etched with confusion and sorrow. The youngest cried quietly, while the others tried to comfort him, pretending to be strong. They stayed for half an hour before leaving. I watched their car disappear along the winding road that led back to the city. I didn't cry. My tears had served their purpose long ago. As months turned to years, they rebuilt their lives. They worked harder, not out of ambition, but out of repentance. The houses they once bought with borrowed money were replaced by smaller homes, built honestly this time, without taking shortcuts through my sacrifices. Their bank accounts refilled, but their pride never did. I occasionally heard from mutual acquaintances that they spoke about me often, never with anger, only with the soft regret that grows in people who finally understand too late. Meanwhile, my life became simple and full again. I joined a small community garden near the coast where retirees tended to rows of flowers and vegetables. We'd exchange stories, laughter, and sometimes recipes. None of them knew my past. I was simply Maria, the lady with the steady hands. In that anonymity, I found freedom. I wasn't the betrayed mother anymore. I was just a woman living her life, quietly, deliberately, joyfully. Every Christmas, I would light a single candle by the window, not for sadness, but for memory. It wasn't to invite them back or to curse their names. It was simply a ritual of peace, a reminder that forgiveness isn't a gift you give others. It's the door you unlock for yourself. Sometimes I still thought about the night they left me standing in the snow. I could remember the cold on my cheeks, the sound of laughter muffled behind closed doors. But those memories no longer hurt. They were like old photographs, faded, quiet, powerless. What remained was the knowledge that I had stood up when the world thought I would stay down. And so my sons lived on, humbled, changed, but alive. They sent Christmas cards each year, and though I never replied, I kept them in a box beside the old family photos. It was my way of saying I still remembered, still cared, but from a distance that kept both sides honest. In the end, I didn't destroy their lives. I only rearranged them so they could finally see what mattered. Regret had replaced arrogance, and responsibility had replaced entitlement. They would never say it aloud, but they knew I had saved them, not from poverty, but from pride. That winter, as I watched the waves crash against the Maine rocks, I realized something quietly profound. Revenge is loud, but justice is quiet. Mine came softly, through paper, signatures, and time. Now, years later, I sit by the wide window of my little cottage in Bar Harbor, watching the tide pull back from the shore. The water glitters in the late afternoon sun, and gulls drift lazily above the rocks. The air smells like salt and peace. This is what freedom feels like. Not revenge, not victory, just the absence of noise. The quiet hum of my old kettle replaces the shouting of ungrateful voices. The world outside has moved on, and so have I. Sometimes, neighbors ask why I live alone at this age. I smile and tell them that peace is better company than pity. They see me tending to my small garden, caring for my flowers, walking to the harbor market every Sunday. No one knows the full story: the suns, the Christmas night, the empty accounts. And I prefer it that way. Some truths are not meant to be repeated aloud. They are meant to rest quietly, like stones beneath calm water. The papers that once changed everything still rest in my drawer, neatly stacked in a brown folder. I haven't touched them in years. I don't need to. The lesson they taught has already done its work. Those signatures didn't just reclaim my dignity. They reminded me that motherhood is not ownership. It is a gift freely given, but it must never be taken for granted. Each Christmas, I still light one candle near the window, not in bitterness, but in memory. I picture my 7 sons, now grown, now humbled, gathered somewhere else with their own families. I hope they are kind to their children. I hope they remember that love is not measured by what you give, but by how you give it. And maybe, when they see an old woman walking alone in the snow, they will stop, open the door, and invite her in. Forgiveness came slowly, like winter thawing into spring. At first, I resisted it. I thought forgiving them meant forgetting what they did. But time has a way of reshaping pain into perspective. Now, when I think of that night, I no longer feel anger. I feel understanding. People forget that parents are not immortal. They think love is an endless well that never runs dry. But even wells go silent if no one draws from them. I have learned that silence is not weakness. It is power. When shouted words lose meaning, silence becomes the final truth. My silence spoke louder than all their excuses. It taught them respect without revenge, remorse without hatred. And perhaps that's what this story is about. Not punishment, but restoration. The world outside my window glows gold as the sun sinks behind the Atlantic. I sip my tea and think of all the women like me, mothers, grandmothers, caretakers, who gave everything and received little in return. To them I say this: you are not powerless. Your worth doesn't fade with age. You are the backbone of every home, the quiet force that built the lives others stand on. Never forget that. And now, if you are watching this, I'll ask you the same question that stays in my heart. It's not about anger. It's about choice. I didn't drain my son's accounts out of spite. I did it because sometimes the only way to be seen is to stop giving. I didn't vanish to make them suffer. I vanished so I could live. I wanted them to understand that love, when taken for granted, turns into silence. And silence, when used wisely, becomes a mirror. So I ask you, if your children left you alone on Christmas night, after years of sacrifice, what would you do? Would you knock again, begging for their kindness? Or would you let your absence teach the lesson your presence never could? I made my choice. I chose peace over pity, justice over tears, and distance over dependence. And today, as the waves roll in and the sky turns the color of forgiveness, I know I made the right one.